Distinguished speakers and dear participants, welcome to a very special webinar jointly organized by Nepal Institute for International Cooperation Engagement and the Millennium Project on, navigating US-China rivalry perspectives from South Asia. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank registered under the Companies Act 2006 of Nepal. It undertakes independent research and activities on issues of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and issues of development. NICE is the host institution of the Millennium Project in Nepal, and I'd like to thank Jerome for that. Jerome Glenn, Executive Director of the Millennium Project, is also with us. He will be sharing about the Millennium Project with us. This is our first joint event on navigating US-China rivalry perspective from South Asia at the time when the differences between US and China are increasing and the competition is being translated into rivalry and conflicts. This rivalry between US and China is much in Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. To explore how the US-China rivalry is being perceived in South Asia, we have invited 4 scholars from South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. At the end, if time permits, I'll touch upon the situation in Nepal. Before we invite our distinguished speakers to make their remarks, I'd like to invite Jerome Glenn, Executive Director of the Millennium Project, for the introductory remarks. Jerome Glenn is the co-founder and the CEO of the Millennium Project. He was the Washington DC representative for United Nations University as Executive Director of the American Council for the UNU from 1988 to 2007. He has over 40 years of future research experience working for government, international organizations, and private industry and decision support systems with the Committee for the Future, Hudson Institute, Future Options Rooms, and the Millennium Project. He has addressed or keynoted conferences over 300 government departments, universities, NGOs, United Nations organizations, and corporations around the world on a variety of future-oriented topics. Jerome, over to you.
Thank you. One of the primary things that the Millennium Project does is it produces a State of the Future report. We've done about 19 of these so far. And over the last 15 years, every State of the Future report has included a goal of a US-China Apollo-like environmental security goal that should be established with a NASA-like R&D program that others can join, but start with US-China first. And the Nepalese Node and others could explore the feasibility of such a goal and its use for navigating the US-China competition. The United States and China, the largest economies, the largest causes of global warming, so they have both an economic responsibility and they have a moral responsibility. And so I hope that people will be pushing for such a joint project. There are some treaties between the United States and China on this, but they're very simple, like exchanging a couple of people and comparing notes, but it's not really a land a man on the moon type bold sort of a goal. So a second element is that the US and China are also in a new kind of technology race that a lot of people are not aware of. They're aware of the artificial intelligence race going on, but that's narrow intelligence. That's like driving a car, diagnosing cancer. The second kind of artificial intelligence is general intelligence, and that cuts across everything. It's sort of like the difference between a fax machine and the internet. They're both part of the information economy, but they're really different. And if we race into this too quickly, the initial conditions of artificial general intelligence, if it does get created, could evolve into a super intelligence beyond our control and not to our interest. So the only chance we have of not having the science fiction stuff is the initial conditions of general intelligence in the beginning. And that transition, we're beginning to look at, that race is going on right now. So we need an international or a global governance system to manage that transition, or else we just have to pray and hope for luck so we turn out okay. The Millennium Project is an old idea. All futures have had the idea of creating a global think tank with global futures around the world, but we've taken it further than anybody else so far. It started in 1996 after a 3-year feasibility study from 92 to 95, put together by UN organizations, governments, NGOs, foundations, corporations, and universities to be like a trans institution, so that we act through these categories and are acted on by these categories, so that our stuff is more coherent than just if we were just one institutional category. Note, Nepal is the 70th node of the Millennium Project. Congratulations. So it's so that's that. This is the idea of people talking about global local. This is our management answer to that idea. So you have people in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and other places identifying who knows the most in the area, and then we all share the information together, and then give it back to all the node chairs, and then they can use it for seminars, conferences, whatever they want to use it for. I don't expect you to read this, but everybody can have a copy of the PowerPoint. This just simply says we've done a lot of different kinds of futures research. We're not into one ideology or one issue or one nation. We're trying to do stuff across the board for humanity as such. The most recent study is the Work Technology 2050, just came out last year. I strongly recommend you read the scenarios in there. They're the best scenarios I've written. I've done this stuff for over 50 years, about 50 years. It's rich in detail. It's not simply describing a future like most things you see. Here are 4 futures. You know, they describe them perfectly fine. But the important thing is how you connect the present to the future, because then there's those if-thens tell you what you don't know that you should know. Our current activity is just finishing actually yesterday, which was a global assessment of developments that we did in combination with Ernst & Young and ourselves. We'll put it, and that stuff goes into our next State of the Future report. We're also doing this assessment at the moment, trying to figure out how to do that global artificial intelligence governance. I serve, by the way, in the IEEE governance committee for just the narrow intelligence, but we're talking about the general intelligence we're looking at. And we're pushing an idea of an Office of UN Strategic Threats, which we've just been in contact with the UN Secretary General's office, and they're going to send us some questions that we will be sending out to the nodes around the world to take a look at how to implement our common agenda. You may have heard about this. This is the most foresight-oriented document I have ever seen come out of the UN General Assembly's office. Foresight is all over it. If you get a hold of our common agenda, do a Google search or do a search in the document on foresight, you'll see it's all over the place. He also, when he was Prime Minister of Portugal, set up his own foresight unit. So he knows how to spell the future. We've got a real champion in the White House we've never had before, as much future-oriented. And I'll work on the next State of the Future report and our World Future Day. I hope you join next March 1st. It's a round the world conversation. And the rest of this information you can get at the website. And I hope you have a lovely future. Let me stop sharing here. There we go.
Thank you, Jerome. Now I would like to start the discussion. Let me first invite Professor Suraj Singh from India. Professor Suraj Singh is Professor for Diplomacy and Disarmament at Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. He is President of Association of Asia Scholars, General Secretary of Indian Association of Asian and Pacific Studies, Guest Professor at Research Institute of Indian Ocean Economics, Yunnan University of Finance and Economics in China, and Advisory Board member of Atlanta-based Communities Without Borders, INC, United States. He has been visiting professor and member of editorial board of several reputed universities and journals around the world. Professor Singh has co-edited Transforming South Asia, Imperatives for Action in 2013, India and the GCC countries, Iran and Iraq, Emerging Security Perspectives in 2013, On China by India from Civilization to State, Cambria 2012, and several others. Professor Singh, over to you, and you have around 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for that generous introduction. I hope you won't deduct my minutes of speaking for that introduction. It's a delight to be on a panel with my friends, Sangha, Shahab, and of course, Jerome, who just spoke to us. Let me be quickly on the subject very directly. We are discussing navigating US-China rivalry, and we are doing so from South Asian perspectives. The first thing I want to bring to the table is that for us here, This is three rivalries that we are talking of, and that is the lens we use to understand US-China rivalry, because in addition to the US-China rivalry, there is also China-India and India-Pakistan rivalry. In that sense, this becomes a kind of a triangular exercise when we look at US-China rivalry, how that is influencing South Asia, and how South Asian rivalries are again contributing to the US-China rivalry. So you could look at the larger global structural drivers, or you could look at the very local drivers like India's reorganization of its province of Jammu and Kashmir, or recent events in Afghanistan. So local as well as global elements are involved here. First thing I want to underline that really is significant to understand why these rivalries are reshaping and recalibrating is that United States for a long time had sought to balance relationship, keeping strongly engaged with Pakistan, with China, also with India. But fundamentally, the unprecedented rise of China has perhaps changed the game for all of us here. And in that sense is recalibrating not just the US-China rivalries, but also China-Pakistan axis or nexus, whatever you wish to call it, or the growing India-US proximity. And I think we need also to remember that we are talking here of the nuclear triangle of three states, China, India, and Pakistan. So let me begin by first talking about the global structural element of it, which is technology and trade war, as we say, constantly going on, expanding into Indo-Pacific region geopolitics, where US and China are largely engaged in that exercise of multiple kinds of contestations, engagements, depending on how you wish to have a look at that. And what is the connection that this larger rivalry has on the ground? Very quickly, if you look at India and China relationship, as recent as September last year, there was accusation after the Galwan big incident that again some firing took place on a line of actual control between China and India. And simultaneously, we were seeing the US fleet in Bay of Bengal holding joint naval exercises with Indian Navy, and that led to insinuations of all kinds. And I want to cite some examples because the Millennium Project colleagues are with us from Washington, DC, for example. Let us look at how these events got interpreted by well-known scholars in DC. Tanvi Madan, for example, she's currently with Hudson Institute. She called this correlationship of tensions on the border and then joint exercises in Bay of Bengal as signaling to China particularly that United States would stand with India. And some of us are reminded of 1971 liberation of Bangladesh time as well, when again US fleet had shown up in Bay of Bengal. So there's a connotation of some historical events here. Likewise, you saw Jeff Smith of Heritage Foundation. He called this as a reflection of complementarity, or what he calls complementary forces emerging in the proximity of United States and India. And he calls it drifting or pushing India from its traditional effort at soft balancing China to more overt and obvious material visible balancing of China, in that sense supported by United States in that sense. We also see that United States and India have had now these 2+2 dialogues. And in November, they signed some agreement called BECA, Basic BECA agreement, basically Communications and Engagement Agreement, which is third of the foundational agreements. And that was interpreted by someone we all know, Michael Kugelman at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He called it a game changer. And he defined how now non-aligned movement of India was really finally drifting under the name of strategic autonomy, where it was shifting from Moscow, which was a kind of proximity India built in dealing with Pakistan threat in 1971, to now proximity or leaning on Washington, DC with the larger threat of China looming on India. So scholars sitting in Washington, DC themselves are saying that there's a direct correlation of United States rivalry with China redefining local rivalries within South Asia, whether it is China, India, or India, Pakistan. Now to go back to what is the official version of it. 2018 United States Strategic Framework on Indo-Pacific itself says very directly, and I'm quoting it, a strong India in cooperation with like-minded countries would be a counterbalance to China. So there is no mincing of words here when United States wants to outline its strategy to deal with China and how it sees India playing a certain role in that. And now if you look at the brass tacks on the ground, after signing this BECA agreement last year, November, there's a whole advanced set of technological cooperation which is being opened up. And now, for example, there is a talk of sharing of satellite data, topographic data, drones, advanced aviation, advanced navigation on US supplied aircrafts, etc. And this is all meant to help India to achieve more accurate targeting and monitoring of what is happening on the other side of line of actual control vis-a-vis PLA armed forces. And to some extent, that support was visible during last year when the tensions were built. And there was reports about some kind of United States help to India in providing that information data for movement of PLA forces in that region. Now, how is that impacting Indian preparedness to deal with China? Two things. One, very obviously in last 20 years, 20 billion plus of defense contracts signed, enormous amount of contracts with European countries and Israel, for example. Japan is negotiating. So a whole new effort at modernizing Indian armed forces through procurements, primarily through procurements from United States and its friends and allies, so to say, in that sense. And in that backdrop, even Indian organization of armed forces is being organized, reorganized, and we are talking of creating 5 theater commands for Indian armed forces. And that would again be sort of very clearly focused on actual operations, which are going to be sort of forward frontline operation driven kind of exercise. Now, obviously, there is a repercussion to the other connect or nexus or axis that we call of China-Pakistan. The moment India and United States have signed 3 foundational agreements, and last year again, I think in November, China-Pakistan also signed an MOU. And I remember when I was young in 1975 September as well, there was an agreement signed by Bhutto, which was called the Agreement for Science and Technology Cooperation, what was understood as cooperation in sensitive technologies, shall we say, if you don't want to call it nuclear and missile technologies. Likewise, an MOU again signed, but media is talking about this MOU of November 2020 between China and Pakistan being focused on intelligence and technology sharing to provide Pakistan same advantage of monitoring and better targeting Indian military positions or military movements on other side of line of control between India and Pakistan in this case. China is increasingly driven in engaging Pakistan now because of its China-Pakistan economic corridor. I would even put my neck out by saying the most significant reason for Pakistan being engaged by China today is this enormous Belt and Road Initiative component, which is most significant for China. And then that is the route China wants to become a global power, and Pakistan being a close friend is seen as a flagship project, which is what it wants to showcase. So the enormous focus has been on this infrastructure and the security of this infrastructure, which has kept them together all the time. And the MOU that I just mentioned in that backdrop, therefore, Senator Anwar ul Haq Kakkad, for example, from Pakistan Senate himself said that this MOU is signed for ensuring to counter onslaughts of India backed by United States. So there is again a sense of US-China rivalry pushing even India-Pakistan rivalry and pushing India-China rivalry is what I'm saying. So how to, what the theme says, navigating through this US-China rivalry. That is my last 1 minute to speak on. Fundamentally, I want to flag here the episode of 15th August of takeover of Kabul by Taliban. That is an example to all of us in South Asia, whether it is Chinese or Pakistanis or Indians, that more than other countries, United States is driven very, very staunchly by its own national interests. And it can upstick business and make sure it goes away. You have seen the same thing happening in Iraq earlier, and you saw that happening in Afghanistan now. So sometimes this over-reliance on the United States perhaps is a thing that must be taken with a pinch of salt, because United States might suddenly see that its interests are moving in a very different direction. I remember when India and Pakistan had conducted nuclear tests in 1998, Bill Clinton went to Beijing and signed a joint statement saying that China and United States will jointly manage security of South Asia. Now, this was something very, very sort of touchy for countries of South Asia, obviously. So, United States, what happened in Afghanistan is a case study which shows that over-reliance on United States, or in that sense, over-reliance on China as well, perhaps may not be a very good thing for South Asian countries to do. They have to be really conscious of ensuring that their own equation, their own ability to protect their interests continues to be located in their own hands, in their own capabilities. Of course, for modernization, they would have to depend on some of these advanced countries. So procurements of advanced technology is fine. But United States coming to rescue any of the situations in South Asia, Afghanistan is a good example of what can happen. And Afghanistan today, thanks to United States so repetitiously, sort of leaving without anyone being ready. You saw Ashraf Ghani had to run away very quickly, who was the closest sort of ally of United States. What has resulted here is much less opportunities and much more challenges for South Asia from Afghanistan. And what we are seeing here is that this part of rivalries being too much in focus and United States-China rivalry perhaps influencing local rivalries far too much is now resulting in China, Pakistan, Russia drifting in one direction. You see, they are not even attending G20 meetings or climate change meetings the way other countries are joining. And on the other side, India, United States, and its other friends and allies are drifting in other direction, which is going to only create more complications, create new rivalries for South Asia. So I'm talking of here China, Taliban, Pakistan on one side, or even you could add to that Turkey, Malaysia, Iran. And on the other side, you have India and European nations and United States and Canada and others. So this is only creating far more complex situation of introducing new rivalries than what we have seen before. To some extent, I will wait till the Pramod speaks about it, but even India and Nepal had a phase of China-US rivalry, creating some kind of irritants between the traditional very close friends, India and Nepal. And in that sense, China's increasing leverages in South Asia are also sometimes interpreted in that larger picture of the US-China rivalries. And in fact, Chinese scholars very often feel that it's only because of them that India is drifting away to United States, which may not be true. I tell them there are other factors. But I would also not deny that the US-China rivalry perhaps is overcasting local rivalries far too much in South Asia. And there is need for caution in that sense. Need to understand that these countries are neighbors. And my last word would be to quote my former Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who used to say that you can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your neighbors. And that choice does not exist for us in South Asia. And therefore, a clear understanding of how far we need to depend on countries that are far away, countries that have their own national interests to drive, and we have seen how they behave in certain situations, do not end up pushing us or taking us on the golden path, and finally we get into a big sort of blind spot where we don't know how to deal with each other. Violence is not an option for South Asia. South Asia has to focus on development. And in that sense, I think I agree that technology transfers, economic investments are fine, welcome, but they should not result in pushing our mutual equations in South Asia, driven by the cosmopolitan great powers outside, and therefore we should not be waylaid in that direction. So I'm underlining how new rivalries are emerging because of the larger US-China rivalry at the global level in this region. I'm also underlining how local rivalries are being recrafted, and I'm not sure if we are in complete control of how these are being recrafted. So that is what I wish to underline, and that with a word of caution is where I want to stop here. And I look forward to listening to my other colleagues, and also in case there are any questions or comments, and I'll try to respond to that. With that, back to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal.
Thank you, Professor Singh. Next, I would like to invite Asanga Abhay Gunasekara, Senior Fellow of the Millennium Project. Abhay Gunasekara is International Security and Geopolitical Analyst and a Strategic Advisor for from Sri Lanka. He was founding Director General of Institute of National Security Studies and Executive Director at Laxman Kadiranga Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies. He is the author of Sri Lanka at Crossroads Towards a Better World Order. He is a keen commentator on geopolitics and conundrum of an island. He has also served as visiting professor at geopolitics and global leadership at Columbia University. He is an alumnus of the US Department IVLP program, National Defense University, NESA NDU, APCSS Hawaii, and Young Global Leader World Economic Forum Geneva. In 2021, Asanga was appointed to the Global Advisory Council at a political academy global, along with former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark. Asanga, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pramod. Let me congratulate Kathmandu. It's a great achievement to become the node from the Millennium Project on the 70th node. And we remember when we became the node in Sri Lanka, and it was a huge achievement because of the amazing tools that you can share with the think tank community, as well as the students, the universities. There's so much of not being used, so tools that are there for foresight analysis, for think tanks. I think so. Let me congratulate. So that's at the beginning, and it's nice to see Professor Swaran Singh, Shahab, and Salma, my friends. So although I'm in DC working, I mean, listening to you all will be, it reminds me to sort of bring the South Asian the values as well as the importance of what's going on in South Asia, and bringing some of the points to the work that I'm doing here. So right now I'm working on a few of the foresight analysis, what's going on, applying China, especially on China in South Asia. And one of the scenarios that I have developed, which was to the USAID, on basically on what's going on with the BRI and what impacts to Pakistan, Bangladesh, as well as Sri Lanka. So I'm looking for bringing in more inputs from you all, as well as the others in South Asia. So with that, I will switch on my presentation. Can you all see?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Basically, I'll bring in a Sri Lankan perspective and how best we could navigate this tension between US and China. And I mean, the last few months that I've been in the US, I've been sort of capturing the US perspective about Sri Lanka and about South Asia, what they have been thinking. I know Professor Swaran mentioned about Tanvi as well as the other scholars in here. So I'm trying to interact with them, as well as I've interacted with a few of the Indian scholars as well as the others in DC, trying to capture what their perception is. So it's sort of a two-way process that I'm doing from Sri Lanka as well as from here. Now, I start with Wang Jisi, the Chinese scholar, who says that we need to manage this turbulence. There is a serious issue that's going on, rightly mentioned by Professor Swaran. First step is building mutual trust, and so that's lacking. And in the relationship, as Jerome mentioned, on technological area like NASA, how US and China could get together, that was a positive sign that you see, but then they are not working together. The trust deficit is widening. The competition is visible in South Asia than any other theater because of the US exit from Afghanistan. The priority number one at the State Department desk is Afghanistan right now. So so Afghanistan is the most important area. So Sri Lanka is a maritime nation, as you all know, with the geostrategic interest. What is required in the foreign policy of Sri Lanka, which I have been sort of writing and speaking about, is that basically the bandwagoning policy, the China bandwagoning policy that has been followed, which forgetting the rules-based norms as well as the international norms, the democratic values, so which has become a threat to the country. The strategic trap, although many reports, such as the Carnegie, which was released a few days ago on the 28th of October, which says that, look, the debt trap is, when you look at the quantification data, Chinese debts are much less than any other nation. But I look at it in a strategic point of view, saying that there is a strategic trap, and a country like Sri Lanka, who's going through an economic crisis right now, is much more vulnerable and is part of the strategic trap. And the reason that I'm saying is because of the quick approval of the Port City project within 30 days, 99-year leases in the Hambantota, as well as basically what's going on in the domestic political landscape. So as we basically look at a perspective need to be captured from the China's point of view also. For example, when we speak about US adventure, Chinese adventurism, or in the South China Sea, what the Chinese used to say is, let's speak about the US adventurism. When we talk about human rights concerns, the Chinese discussion is also about, let's talk about the US human rights concerns. So while these back-to-back discussions, as well as the struggle between the two is going on, I think it's important to visualize what's going on the long game. So that's why the foresight analysis of what's going to happen in 15 years is really important, and to bring in. Here is Rush Joshi from Washington again, where he captures saying that regional balance requires actions in concert with allies and partners. The importance of allies for the US is spoken by many scholars in DC. And how do you develop the Indo-Pacific, the own asymmetric capabilities, basically the spokes in the hub and spoke strategy, the importance of strengthening the spokes, bringing the allies closer to US. And in this, where does Sri Lanka stand right now? So if you look at the significant China tilt because of the Rajapaksa 2.0, the Gotabaya regime, is because of twofolds. One is the security that the regime requires and the human rights support that China gives to the Rajapaksa regime. And it's a reciprocal arrangement where Sri Lankan foreign ministry speaks about Xinjiang as well as Chinese human rights concern. And the second is the Sri Lankan, basically the governance model, how it has impacted a heavy militarization of 26 military appointments. So you see a quasi-democracy moving towards a heavy military. It has already moved, and it has been warned by the Human Rights Commissioner. The recent appointments of, last week there was appointment of ultranationalists, a monk, to head the One Country, One Law Committee, which are dangerous areas, basically, which we have never given to a Buddhist monk to look at, to look at recommendations for countries' laws, which would upset the minority groups. Obviously, I've seen many comments going on. So, these are areas that Sri Lanka should be very cautious about. We had a 30-year civil war, as you know, and we have we have losses of life. And so one should not bring in the ultra-nationalists. What you are having in Sri Lanka is a significant rise of ultranationalism. So the MCC grant, which the loss of the MCC, US MCC grant of 480 million, now the recent comment made by the foreign secretary saying that it was rejected by the people of Sri Lanka, it was is not correct, because it was not rejected by people of Sri Lanka. It was rejected by a committee appointed by the government, and the committee basically came up saying that there's a national security threat by the MCC grant. So I think this, you could apply these things to Nepal, who's actually now going through with the MCC and all that. So you could see what Sri Lanka has lost. We don't want that to happen to another country. So we want you to see in a more broader perspective. We will see the ultra-nationalists, groups who would try to sort of bring in, but don't lose these funds, as well as they're important for the country. And what you see is a significant rise with the pandemic time. And Chinese vaccine diplomacy, which has taken over most of the South Asian countries. And what you see in Sri Lanka is a serious security concern, because when the journalists write about the Chinese vaccine or criticize, so you will be summoned by the criminal investigation department, or you will be taken also. So these are areas that Sri Lanka, which has never seen this sort of involvement. And you can see the degree of Chinese influence from them. So basically, the recent Carnegie report, I will basically give few of the points, and it captures what I had to bear, the entire where Sri Lanka is, as well as some of the South Asian countries. You see that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has let his preference to China-style development model. The Carnegie report basically argues about the CH, the Port City project, and about the National Medicines Regulatory Authority, how China has taken much of the the influencing those state institutions. And what you see is if you look at the how the China has captured for example, you can see the elites of the country or the institutions. We are at a very high risk. So at the bottom, you could see that at a very high risk. And so if you look at the foreign penetration of political actors, the freedom of research, you can see that the Chinese involvement in different sectors and the degree of risk is really high right now. So this is captured by Carnegie, and absolutely correct. And here is the fragile state institutions, how Chinese influence have gone into institutional level. And the bureaucratic level is something that I've looked at from January to April, which we did a research in Sri Lanka, also captured the same data. So the bureaucratic, you can see at a very, very high risk, that the 30-day approval process for the projects like Port City is definitely coming out of the agency that China has created in the bureaucratic level, which is very dangerous. Adherence to law and the procedures, where President Xi as well as Gotabaya mentioned that, look, they agree on following the development model, a new development model, closer to China. So these are areas that I think one cannot ignore, and it's really, really important that these reports capture, as well as the scholars highlight this for the policymakers. So basically the vulnerability, if you look at you can see Sri Lanka at a medium risk, and Bangladesh, they put it at a very high risk. The weak civil society. With this, you see a weakening of the civil society, and Sri Lanka is at the medium. But what we captured, in our initial, was at a high risk of the civil society. And also the state systems which you have, like I said, the bureaucracy, and also Sri Lanka is at a very high risk, and which is very dangerous. I would say the input coming in and the influence coming in. from China. And here, what you see is the China focus, how the countries have focused on China, interaction between government and political parties. You see the Rajapaksa 2.0 is not equal to the 1.0, which is his brother's regime. You see a significant rise. You can see that I have circled that in the report. A significant rise of China or Chinese intervention with the political parties as well as the government. And so this particular agency has, I mean, you see that with the China Friendship Association in the country, or Chinese, the CCP and the Rajapaksa political party, you have seen a significant rise in that. So the political, the interference will impact the domestic politics, so China's involvement in domestic politics. So why are they doing in such a, you can see that the time span of the previous is quite like in about few years, you see all those, the interference coming in. Why is the hurry? I mean, the question which I asked was because I think President Xi's 15-year time frame, he's looking at a 15-year time frame and a very quick, actionable results, such as Port City. You see many other, not only Sri Lanka, but many other places around the world. The US decline, China has taken it very seriously, and with the financial crisis, Donald Trump, and you see that, okay, this is the time to move forward. You see that the US, the Chinese, the adventurism, or you see the coercive economic practices, and the wolf warrior style, which came from the pandemic. Is a clear, basically a style that is that Chinese, you can see from the Colombo Twitter handle of the Chinese embassy, how they respond to basically, which they usually respond in a very diplomatic manner. So they have changed their style. And the internal challenges probably President Xi is having with its CCP and the Leninist structure, to hold the structure as well as to move forward. So, so how do we navigate as South Asian nations? I mean, protecting democratic norms, the rules-based order, balancing in foreign policy, which is required. Here I quote the Bangladesh foreign minister, which is quite interesting when he was asked about the Quad. And when he was asked about the Quad by the Chinese ambassador, the Bangladeshi foreign minister said that is up to us, that our country will decide. So which is
you have maximum 2 minutes. Yeah.
Got it. All right, thank you. So and that's really important, and other countries could follow. And the non-interference on domestic affairs is really an important area. And multilateralism, minilateralism, such as India, Sri Lanka, and Maldives, which we came together, are really important areas to look at. The significant military, I would say, on build-up, on asymmetric capabilities also need to be looked at. And so reversing the China's belligerent behavior requires diplomatic finesse and institutional creativity. What is required is institutional creativity, and we need to sort of look at it, and bringing in infrastructure standards, as well as the contribution from the allies is really important for a rules-based order. So I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Asanga. May I now invite Dr. Salma Malik. Dr. Salma Malik is an assistant professor at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at Quaid-e-Azam University in Pakistan. She is an alumnus of the Uppsala University of Sweden and Asia Pacific Center for Strategic Studies, APCSS Hawaii, and visiting research fellow at Sandia National Lab, New Mexico, US. Besides being a member of IISS London, she is part of various regional center for strategic studies, consortium of South Asian think tanks, Social Science Research Council, WISCOMP, and WDN USA. Previously, she has also worked at Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, and have several publications on her name. Dr. Malik, over to you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Jaiswal. I'm extremely grateful. And it's so great to see an assembly of excellent friends and colleagues from the region. So you couldn't wish for anything better than that. When you're looking at the US-China rivalry, it's actually ironic from the words that Professor Swaran Singh said as to how the Cold War is playing in another direction. Several decades back, we were saying virtually the similar stuff, but the binaries at that time were much different from what the binaries are saying today. Pakistan was allied with the US, and we really didn't care about Soviet Union. And now it's all going reverse, and it's an entirely new Cold War binary that is being created, or overcasting the regional rivalries, as Professor Singh also pointed out. This was similar to what was happening several decades down, but now many realities have shifted, many priorities have shifted, and what we have seen in the last couple of years is that there are different developments which are interconnected with each other, interlinked with each other at different levels, starting from the global to the regional to the extra-regional and the individual states. If you're looking at developments taking place at the global level, not only is there post-COVID challenges related to economics, but we have also seen that the wave of ultranationalism that had started several years back has now, because of COVID, made countries respond to this complex or compound crisis in a very different fashion. But with that, we've also come to this realization that having traditional security as our biggest firewall hasn't really helped us much. And every country, big or small, have had to face this new emerging crisis as it happened a year and a half back. And now we are all responding to it in a different fashion. And then we look at issues such as climate change and so many other things, which require a cooperative attitude rather than a conflictual attitude. But unfortunately, the global realities are of a nature where we would see that countries, despite having common concerns, have a different perspective on that. When we look at the region, from the region side, what we see is several developments happening, and the most pronounced in the last couple of weeks to a couple of months has been the Afghan issue, the Afghanistan crisis, which was something which was writing on the wall as of the Doha Agreement. However, the US unceremonious withdrawal from Afghanistan is something that is a real case study in point. And unfortunately, the entire repercussion of what happens in Afghanistan, where it has strong resonance throughout the region. The biggest country that would face a fallout of the Afghanistan crisis is Pakistan. As much as any of the regional countries feel and think that Pakistan has been supporting the Taliban are there because of Pakistan. This is something which needs to be re-examined and re-evaluated, because despite the fact that Pakistan did have a connection with the Taliban in terms of communication and in terms of telling the US in the last 20 years of its engagement, physical engagement in Afghanistan, that they need to not only fight or have a traditional way of handling the Afghan crisis, but they also need to negotiate with all the stakeholders. And suddenly we see towards the end of US 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan, speed tracking towards a dialogue with the Taliban and negotiating Doha, foregoing any and all of the concerns and the values for which the US had entered Afghanistan, or whose preservation was one of the priority agenda items for the US, least of all of those being women and their placement in a conflict-ridden, Taliban-infested Afghanistan. And that was the biggest talk of the town 20 years back in Washington, D.C. But today, the same Afghan woman, after facing a lot of promise, after seeing a lot of hope in the last 2 decades, stands totally confused, totally disillusioned, totally directionless, and totally without cover. Many of us have been in the capital city all across Pakistan, been receiving word from our Afghan friends and colleagues and acquaintance that they need to be evacuated, and Pakistanis need to help them in some capacity. And Pakistan is providing with transit passage and all of those things, which it would do because that is the requirement of the day. That is a humanitarian aspect, and Pakistan would not shy away in any capacity. And that puts any country next to a conflict-ridden country that we have to respond on a humanitarian basis, despite the fact that unfortunately Pakistan is not a very strong economically endowed country. Unfortunately, also for the fact that Pakistan has been trying to tell the world capital, and some of them are grudgingly now listening to Pakistan, that please do not give up on what was Project Afghanistan for the US, because at the end of the day, whatsoever the regime in Afghanistan was, whether it was the Ghani regime, and I do respect and apologies to anyone who may take offense from my next remark and comment. But the very fact is that if people do not trust the Taliban for all the genuine and logical reasons that they should not trust the Taliban, what did the Ghani government do for the Afghans as such? The minute the crisis became imminent, the first thing that we saw was that they boarded a flight full of money. A lot of other allies, not only Dr. Ashraf Ghani, a person whose big fan I was when I read his work on failed states and the architecture to save them. But this is not what you do to your country, and the entire Afghan political elite vacated the country, leaving the country in a political void. And I would also say another qualifier, that the Taliban's August 15th moving into Kabul is not exactly a victory for the Taliban, as much as it is a void left open for any actor to occupy. And this was the best thing that they could do, because they found no resistance at all. There was no Afghan security force to help them, to check them or anything of that sort. In this scenario, the country that would face the brunt would be Pakistan, unfortunately, if the humanitarian crisis becomes any bit bigger. Plus the fact that with winters approaching, and as the food supplies, the money, the finances, and all of those things are becoming scarce in Afghanistan, the fallout of this entire humanitarian crisis would be felt very severely in Pakistan. And Pakistan is trying to brace for that. But let's see how, one can only hope and pray that such a crisis is averted. Any efforts to destabilize Afghanistan, any efforts by the US, because we know that the US is very angry with Pakistan at the moment. They need a scapegoat, and Pakistan has always been that traditional scapegoat, which can very easily be blamed for a fiasco in Afghanistan. And any amount of scapegoating is not really going to help Afghanistan at all in any capacity. What will actually happen is that the situation is going to get worsened. And any efforts to destabilize Afghanistan any further than what it is at the moment will again compound the humanitarian crisis, and it's going to snowball into a regional problem rather than just a cross-border aspect for Pakistan, for Iran, for any of the Central Asian countries. So one needs to keep that in mind. And of course, at the state level, when we see there have been waves of ultranationalism, Pakistan has had its ultra-religious nationalist waves way back in the 70s and 80s. And now we are actually giving solid advice of not to do what other regional countries are doing. Case in point, I would not shy away from saying what is happening in India, which are going to have long-term repercussions for the civil society and the region at large. Now, how does the US and the Chinese rivalry fit into this? For countries such as Pakistan, which are cash-strapped, which need economic help, China provides unconditional economic help. China provides also Pakistan, whether Pakistan is China's entry into the world theater as a great power. Projects such as the CPEC, the bilateral BRI tier, and that also provides Pakistan with this opportunity that we can actually piggyback on the CPEC and access global markets if we choose to do so. It also provides Pakistan with an economic empowerment in this shifting scenario from geostrategic to geoeconomic, if we choose to do so. But what is the spin side of this? What is the negative side to this? It puts Pakistan in the, what should I say? It makes Pakistan a ground zero for the US-China rivalry. And since US and China may not be able to damage each other so directly as was the tradition during the Cold War, then the proxy war front would be Pakistan. So the US can hurt China through its allied countries such as Pakistan. Professor Swaran Singh's point about the BICA and several other strategic alliances or agreements that the US and India have carried out with one another in order to strengthen their partnership, and Quad being yet another of those strategic partnerships, makes Pakistan extremely uneasy. Whether it's a partnership that they're doing to counter China or to strengthen India's interest in the Indo-Pacific. But the very fact is that any of those capabilities and capacities can very easily be used against Pakistan. And Pakistan totally feels legitimate in not only raising these concerns, but also Pakistan feels that if such defense ties happen, that can create a lot of destabilizing effect in the region. That also compounds the picture into a situation where at one point you have the US-China rivalry unfolding, and the South Asian region being that proxy front where this rivalry or the new Cold War binary between Pakistan and India is yet again emerging with a slight change in partnership. And that is actually, I find, extremely fascinating and ironic as to how over the 7 decades, these partnerships have shifted and how significantly they have shifted. And for this reason, if Pakistan feels that China is providing Pakistan with that defense opening that is not affordable to Pakistan from any other Western quarters, then it feels all entirely legitimate and entirely capable of doing what it wants to do. So having any kind of defense agreements,
2 more minutes.
yes, I'm just give me 2 minutes and I'm going to finish then. I'm sorry if I'm lengthening in that regard. So looking at this overall scenario, I would say a couple of things. And one, of course, is that Pakistan would actually like not to choose sides in the US-China rivalry. However, having said this, it is not going to be an easy ride. It is going to be a very difficult situation where China does not restrict Pakistan's options to interact with other actors. Although as China becomes strengthened, we do hear slight remarks in that direction. However, Pakistan would also not like to be looked upon through the Afghan lens, through the China lens, through the counterterrorism lens that US tends to look Pakistan at. The next aspect and the last aspect that I would say is that in a time when you have problems such as the COVID, you have climate change, so many other non-traditional threats which are occupying the international attention, I think we need to actually go for a cooperative regime which brings forth a new toolkit for cooperation, for joining hands in not only responding to the challenges in the future, but also to effectively mitigate these challenges and help countries such as Pakistan fulfill SDGs and so many other aspects that can strengthen the region rather than make it another ground zero for the forthcoming Cold War between US and China. Thank you very much, Professor Jaiswal.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. May I now invite Professor Sahab Inam Khan. Professor Sahab Inam Khan is director at Bangladesh Enterprise Institute and visiting fellow at NICE. He is also serving at the Department of International Relations at Jahangirnagar University in Bangladesh. He has served as advisor, international consultant, board members of various international organizations. He also served as member of several high-level committees formed by the government of Bangladesh, and he is accredited by drafting several key public opinion documents. He has also engaged with University of Delaware, USA, and University of Birmingham, UK, NASA Center, National Defense University, Washington, DC, and Hainan Institute of World Watch, China. Over to you, Mr. Khan.
Thank you very much, Pramod. It was a pleasure seeing you at Kathmandu this week. And of course, Salma, is a long old friend, and Asanga has been a buddy for a long, long time. Hi, Asanga. And I was intrigued by what Professor Singh was talking about, and that was fascinating. At the end of the day, it is essentially nothing is going to be resolved by the extra regional power unless the countries within the region understands the value of the blurring line between geopolitics and the geoeconomics, that the COVID, or perhaps the hardcore reality that has come back to the South Asia. And I was pretty much intrigued when Salma Malik was talking about the Afghan reality and its linkages with Pakistan and the neighborhood. And in fact, I was in Doha last week, and there was a fascinating discussion going on when you look into the current situation in the Central Asia. And if you look at what's happening in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan, that gives you a completely different geopolitical reality that we often forget to bring in our discourse of South Asian politics, and perhaps beyond, which is often seen within the greater prism of Indo-Pacific. And obviously, I was pretty fascinated again the reality that has unfolded during the post withdrawal, US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And obviously that also reminds you an old proverb called history repeats itself. And you have seen that the whole Doha dialogue started from the late 2015, and nobody can say, argue that the resurgence or perhaps what we call Taliban 2.0 just suddenly appeared, which is not the fact, and it has been unfolding for quite some time. Now the question is whether the states of South Asia were prepared to accept that particular geopolitics, or perhaps the real politics that suddenly came, or perhaps was in the making, which we were not prepared for to accept within our foreign policy decision making. Now that comes, that reminds us of three very critical factors in our understanding of what we are discussing today in terms of the rivalry. Now, when we talk about rivalry, I often become skeptic. In a sense, I was listening to the Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Mr. Blinken, Secretary Blinken, this January in Alaska, and the discussion that didn't end with a very happy note, but certainly I used to label that as a civilization and dialogue, asking each other, the Americans asking the Chinese, and the Chinese asking the Americans, who essentially has the moral right to dictate the rest of the world. That again, the question even Professor Singh brought in 1971, when the USS Enterprise was entering the waters of the Bay of Bengal, the reality of the Cold War and the reality of the so-called rivalry between China and United States is perhaps different, and having another presence of USS Enterprise like is probably going to be quite a harsh reminder of a very not so very peaceful future in the making. Now, saying that, what I understood when the nomenclature of rivalry should be seen as more in terms of the divergence in the interest rather than seeing it from a very conflict prism. I mean, even if I take one classic example of technology that Professor Singh has talked about, Asanga has talked about, and it has been discussed in every global platform these days, that who will have the much more upper privilege in terms of technological growth. That's exactly where the competition comes in rather than the rivalry. Now, the Chinese may have upper hand in 5G or 6G, or whether it is Washington-led industries. But at the end of the day, both the countries have to exist and provide that technology to the rest of the world. The question is, the Americans will always be talking about the value-based, norm-based, institution-based system for which they would need to ensure that there is an equitable growth as well as equal growth across the world, for which they really would require to infuse the technological advancement that they have made. Now, the question is whether the countries, for an example, I come from Bangladesh, my number one question will be, can I afford the technologies that will be built or supplied by the Europeans or the Americans? And that's exactly where the Chinese would come with the competitive advantage. Now, essentially, the whole geopolitics of technology will be determined by the geoeconomics or perhaps the pricing of the market. And that's exactly for the countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, or perhaps Nepal, or even Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, for everyone, the question will be much more related to economics rather than the hardcore geopolitics or geostrategic choices. So the rational choice will determine the level of geostrategic engagement, even if we are talking about the greater rivalry, greater convergence, greater divergence, or whatever. That's exactly why I often tell that there is a blurring line in making between the geoeconomics and geostrategy that we have to be very careful about. The second very important point that I believe that there is a limit of disengagement between the Chinese and the Americans. Now, when I mention the idea of limits of disengagement, the second level of question comes in, that how far the Americans and the Chinese can literally go against each other. Professor Singh has rightly mentioned, even G20, even COP, wherever you're now seeing that there is a greater divergence being shown between each countries. But at the end of the day, pandemic was one classic example that essentially showed that the non-traditional security aspect will not wait for either or. Which means, even if you look, again, I'm coming from Bangladesh and stating the position of Bangladesh, that the economic guarantees will be much more important than the security guarantees at the moment in terms of strategic or defense orientation towards any of the countries. What does it mean? It means the whole idea of development is now linked with the strategic choices of these countries. Now, whether the Turkish are going to be much more effectively engaged in Bangladesh's development, or the Saudis, or the Americans and the Chinese, will be dependent on the two grounds. One is the domestic political priority, which is extremely related to economic growth. And the second is what kind of political or domestic politics we have in these two countries. Now, even if you look into the stretch of the South Asia, starting from all the way to Afghanistan down, I'm linking Myanmar over here for obvious reason that Bangladesh is one of the critical factor in its outward relationship is Myanmar. You are now seeing a making of an arc of instability for the past few months. And even if you look at the arc of instability, there now you're talking about what kind of political governance we will have over there, and what is the necessity, or what are the priorities of the political leadership over there. Now, the foreign policy or the strategic policy will be much more dependent on what kind of leadership we have in this country. Now, Myanmar being one of the classic examples Salma was talking about, that the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, where you have both the strategic element, maybe the magnitude of that strategic element can vary and we can debate about it, but certainly the economic variance over there is quite high too. And that's exactly where the Chinese interest is there when it comes to Myanmar. And there is exactly where the Bangladesh's variance would also come, essentially, because again, Bangladesh's foreign policy, Bangladesh's national security, Bangladesh's national interest in terms of Bay of Bengal, access to Southeast Asia, and obviously access to the global system is heavily dependent on how stable Myanmar will be in future. So therefore, again, how Bangladesh will deal with China and the United States will have repercussion on how Bangladesh's relationship with Myanmar will be. And that's exactly where Bangladesh's focus on the multilateralism will come in. And that's exactly where Bangladesh will remain committed to multilateralism. Now, the question is, how committed the Chinese and the Americans will be in multilateralism, and exactly where the rational tipping point for Bangladesh will also dictate the national approach towards Bangladesh's foreign policy in terms of the rivalry, or perhaps what I say divergence, or the limits of disengagement. One very important point that has come from Professor Singh is also the issue of recalibration. And I think this is one very important point, which is often misconstrued in the international media as well as in its international or perhaps the regional politics. Now, this recalibration can go in a positive way, and obviously there can be doldrum about it. Now, this recalibration is essential, and the nuclear triangle that has been discussed over here comes with another two very critical factor. Even if you look at the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, and the Pacific, you have never seen the amount of or the degree of the submarines or the military vehicles or the naval vehicles, movement of naval vehicles, including the nuclear movement or nuclear submarines or tools moving around this much in history, probably in the recent history. That also tells you that the waters are increasingly becoming vulnerable. How do we deal with that? Do we have international norms for that? Do we have regional norms for that? Now, Quad is obviously being discussed, which has loosely been tied with the regional countries having different approaches to Quad and water of the Pacific or Indian Ocean. And perhaps then suddenly you saw that the making of Australia, UK, US ties and shaking the entire genesis of the UK, French, Indian, US and French, Australia, and a different type of subsets within the international system. That tells you how
2 more minutes.
Thank you very much. And that also tells you that the very genesis of mistrust comes in. And then within that particular denomination of mistrust, how far the South Asian countries will go on, which reminds me of sometimes even within AUKUS, I would think about Delhi. When it comes to Afghanistan, I would talk about my friends, many of my friends in Pentagon would be reciting Lady Macbeth's historic historic dialogue, "Out damn spot, I say." Now, the question is that how much leverage then this so-called rivalry will have on the countries, whether it is Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, will essentially be depending on what kind of geopolitical or geostrategic leverage these countries will build within their domestic structure and within the regional countries. And perhaps even being a Bangladeshi, I mean, I would always echo King Richard by saying, "My crown I am, but still my griefs are mine." And that's the political reality that we often try to ignore. Even the technology is taking place, new generations are coming, and the demography has heavily shifted the conventional political as well as geopolitical thoughts that we often still being preaching within our people or within our nationalist egoism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Khan, for your remark. We are running out of time, and I intentionally did not interrupt the speaker as it was really difficult to put the remark on such an important topic in 8 to 10 minutes, as the topic covers very vast trajectory. We have lots of questions basically on the Facebook Live, but due to time constraint, we'll have to postpone it for some other occasion. We wish to organize this discussion in series. However, we'll have 1 or 2 minutes for each speaker if they wish to add any point to their presentation. But before that, let me take 1 or 2 minutes to highlight on the situation of China-US competition or rivalry in Nepal. US-China rivalry is visible even in small South Asian states like Nepal, as we all know. But many experts believe that US-China rivalry is very recent. But I think it's not very recent. It's not very new. It dates back to 1970s. Especially in Nepal. In 1971, there was Khampa rebellion in Nepal, which was supported by Americans. However, the conflict managed, or you can say changed into competition during Kissinger era. The US-China rivalry is going to expand in days to come. Reason is that China is expanding its footprint in Nepal as well as in South Asia, and we see no sign of China backing out. Not only Nepal, but the whole region, because we have seen that Chinese President Xi Jinping has a special interest in South Asia. He is the first Chinese president who has visited almost all the Southeast countries, except Bhutan, with which it does not enjoy diplomatic relations. In the past, China and India had a kind of understanding that they would not allow US in the region, Nepal in particular, and South Asia in general, as it could destabilize the South Asian region. One of the reasons also was that India had closer ties with USSR, and they didn't want American to play in the backyard. But Pakistan was a place where US had a strong presence. But in recent times, the rise of China in South Asia is of great concern for India. Thus, India wants to pull America in the region to fill the vacuum that has been created, that has been filled by the Chinese, and it has been created by India actually, because traditionally India was the one that is captured those places. Rise of China is at 2 levels here in this region. One is obvious rise of China, that when you emerge as a power, you create spaces around yourself. At the same time, when there is flawed or failure or lack of clear policy of traditional powers. When I say traditional powers here, India or sometimes United States. When India is not able to, when Indian policy fails in Nepal, it creates a space for China. It automatically creates for China. When India is not able to deliver or not able to perform well in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, it creates a space for China. So that is happening in the whole region. In Nepal, both BRI and MCC are struggling. While Nepal has signed MOU on BRI, it has made no progress in the last 3 years. But on the contrary, the United States has failed to get MCC endorsed from the parliament. However, where do small states like Nepal or Southeast stand? Like where do Nepal or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka stand on the issues of this competition, or you can say rivalry? I think all wants to remain neutral. They want to refrain from this in this competition. They don't want to choose sides because they believe that they do not have the capacity to diffuse the tension. So that is where they stand. What is the reason behind that? Why they don't want to take sides with US or China? The reason is that every small country in South Asia have economic interest of China. China is a next door neighbor. At the same time, they have a strong economic interest. And it's not only small neighbor of South Asia which has economic interest with China. It's even the UK, India, Japan, Australia, or America has similar intentions. They also enjoy similar economic engagement with the United States. With China. So it's not only small neighbors that have those kind of desire, or they want to use that opportunity. Almost all the countries that do not enjoy cordial ties with Beijing, like US, Japan, or India, have a strong economic engagement with Beijing. So that is where all the neighbors want to benefit in the similar manner. I'd like to end here, but let me give 1 to 2 minutes to each speaker if they want to make any comments. Let me start from the reverse order. Let me first go to Professor Khan.
Thanks, Pramod. I think I don't have much to add, but I would certainly be very cautious about the rivalry issue. Because all these countries, I mean, I get to hear, as I mentioned, many things would depend on what kind of political leadership we have across the region. I mean, the more we have the approach, strategic approach or defensive approach or defense-oriented approach, I think we will be more worried. The first important factor over here is the South Asians would need intra-regional trade. I mean, I'm talking about it for a long time, because even if you look at the intra-regional trade within these countries, shows you the level of cooperation is much more on paper rather than in practicalities. I mean, still we are the least possible trade-friendly region in the world, less than 5 to 6%. That's one. The second is how much debt, how much infrastructure, how much technological necessity that we have to be very practical about it. I mean, we have seen that there has been cases of illogical debt. There has been a lot of incidences or perhaps examples of unnecessary spending. And we have seen there are cases of politically motivated projects which didn't really help the government at the end of the day, whether across the region. So therefore, we have to be very careful about it, whether we get these things from the Western countries or the Eastern countries, or perhaps within our own selves. We have to be very careful about it. At least Bangladesh has done fairly good in that respect. So this debt trap is pretty much a concern for many countries, but not certainly for Bangladesh at the moment. But I'm telling it, but this sort of concerns are pretty much there. And the last point is, I think we will also have to be very careful about the foreign policies that we have, because these are also linked with what kind of nationalism we are trying to establish across the region, and that will have spillover effect across the border, and that might not go very well for regional stability.
Thank you. Dr. Malik, would you like to add?
Thank you very much. Never give space to a professor, because we ask for 2 minutes and we talk for 20. Anyway, so just a few things that I would like to flash, that I wanted to flash earlier as well. One, of course, is the fact that at certain times it seems, and this was also a question asked by one of the participants here, that why singling out China? But unfortunately, many a times in South Asia, what you tend to see is that the US has almost conceded space to China in all capacities. And the only focus at the moment appears to be a very traditional defense-related focus that the US is building with India, because India has its needs, the US has its needs, so they're coming together and joining hands, rather than actually investing in a smart fashion in South Asia, the point Shahab has also raised, and the point that China is actually positively doing, and that is that through BRI, CPEC, they're engaging with the countries that require geoeconomic help and partnership. But unfortunately, would China actually be able to offer the type of capacity building that the US has done over the 70 long years since the Second World War? So that is something that one needs to see, because China and the US strategic culture, thinking, and the way they perform and interact are very different. But China in a position of power, how it would respond and how it would react to various countries around it, that is something that one needs to see in the coming decades. But I hope it does not again go back to the point, and I would say 2 aspects. One, of course, strengthening regional connectivity between regional actors, and also recognizing that South Asia is our territory. We cannot sublet it further to any extra regional powers for their rivalry, but it's ideal speak. But the fact is that unless and until we come together, interact with each other, there is no saving South Asia. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, it's a very pessimistic note that I'm bringing here, but we need to have our own solutions to our own problems.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. Asanga?
Thanks, Pramod. I think the question on the chat box definitely. I mean, China is a great civilization nation, so you need to understand China. Chinese point of view is important that we need to understand Chinese. I mean, if you talk about peaceful rise of Chinese foreign policy, then we will need to look at from the Chinese perspective also. In the Washington, what I hear is that there's a Chinese invasion coming in. No, there's no Chinese invasion. There's an unnecessary fear created in DC circles that you know, there is an invasion going on. What is required is some sort of diplomatic finesse. That's what I mentioned. Balancing what Professor Swaran also spoke about. What's lacking in countries, in our own countries like Sri Lanka, and many other countries in South Asia, is that diplomatic finesse to balance its own foreign policy while creating, you know, unnecessary fear. So such as showing that MCC is a national security threat, the Millennium Challenge, the fund, which is absolutely not. And the commercial innovation is required from the countries like Sri Lanka as well as the other South Asian. We don't have much commercial innovation. That's why we are the least integrated region. Well, exactly what Sahab was talking about. And then the institutional creativity is required at the bureaucratic level, at many other levels. So the institutional creativity is really, really important. I think these are the factors, and recalibration, like Professor Swaran mentioned, is of course, it requires recalibration. We are not, I mean, I think it is a misunderstanding that we are not sort of bashing China. It's required to look at it, recalibrate its own position, bring in standards. Why would you have an airport without flights in Sri Lanka right now? Right now we have an airport. There's no flights. We build it. So there you go. There's something wrong with the business model. So we need to build standards to our projects. We need to share what went wrong in Sri Lanka. As a South Asian one community, we can do that. So we don't, that's why I mentioned that what happened to us with the MCC, we don't want that to happen with Nepal. So thank you.
Thank you, Asanga. Professor Swaran Singh?
Thank you, Pramod. Let me anecdotally begin with Asanga's reference to civilization. The South Asian subcontinent, we have seen history of 5,000 years was celebrated as a civilization. And once the largest Mongol empire expanded, you know, they found this subcontinent, and then came, you know, people from Fargana Valley, from, you know, Persia, from other places. And in 500 years, we people in South Asia understood to be careful of these foreign invaders. And we started following a strategy of assimilation. So you had a great Mughal empire in this part of the subcontinent. Then came Industrial Revolution, and prior to that, the European fleets who used oceans to approach South Asia. By that time, South Asians had understood how to deal with foreigners, and said, we have to be very cautious with you people. The Europeans said, we are not invaders, we are traders. It took us another 250 years to understand they were no less invaders than the earlier invaders. China is the new kid on the block. I'm happy that some of you, particularly Pramod, underlined the fact that India very often is not able to match up the attraction that turnkey projects that China brings to the board. Agreed. But then China gives people what it is good at giving, not necessarily what people need on the ground. Second, all of you, I'm happy to see, have already underlined the kind of opaqueness, accountability, interest rates, the commercial feasibility or unviability commercially. You know, we ended colonial heritage in this part of the world by Hong Kong returning after 99 years of lease to China. China today has leased Hambantota for 99 years, Gwadar for 43 years. So I think there is a growing understanding of money not being the only relationship that nations share between them, and how in South Asia, we countries share relationships which are geological, geographical, historical, cultural, people to people, linguistic, ethnic, you name it, religious. It's a very different kind of intertwining that we all in South Asia share. And China walks in with interesting commercial projects and strategic perspectives of their own, which is a lower. Chinese, like I often say, each nation has a character. China is a regime-driven state. It's not people-driven state. Chinese regime engages local regimes, and local regimes are happy to see their plank on the project, irrespective of the terms. And that leader goes down the history saying, I set up this airport, or I set up the port, which is not even functioning, as Asanga says. So that law, which is initial law of turnkey projects coming, is beginning to be understood by people on the ground. So you can see repeatedly the criticism that the Chinese ambassadors in Kathmandu faces now by people, by elite, by intellectuals, by university students, teachers in China, the way she was masquerading in conducting local politics. So the new world warrior diplomacy, the new terms of engagement, even Pakistan, the greatest friend, sweeter than honey, stronger than Himalayas, deeper than oceans relationship, only country where Chinese want a 15,000 force troops to be raised to protect Chinese investments and Chinese engineers, and you nevertheless have people being kidnapped and killed in dozens. Out of $62 billion promised, about $8 billion so far from 2015 to 2020 on the ground. Same period, India has received China's $4 billion of investments. No troops raised to save Chinese citizens in India. So sometimes we miss the point that, apparently it looks China-India rivalry, but there is also enormous engagement that is happening at the same time. So sometimes countries have leaders who are fascinated with these sudden, offers being made, and they see electoral advantages in sort of pursuing that engagement with China. But that is going to be definitely short term. And we are realizing one after another countries showcasing how people on the ground begin to protest, how local elites begin to disengage with Chinese. No harm in engaging with China, no harm. There is enormous deep pockets, as Salma says, China has, and they can invest. But on what terms are they investing? How long-term benefits are going to be drawn from those investments? I'm not denying the fact China is the largest source for India's imports, even today, despite all Galwan and Doklam and other tensions on the border. Are we really carefully calibrating our engagement with both China or European Union or with ASEAN or United States? Or is there a certain intoxication effect that initially some of our leaders faced? And that looked like China was beginning to hijack the situation in South Asia. I'm happy all of you have underlined how gradually we are all waking up to the fact that we have to be far more cautious, how our interests lie, as Shahab just mentioned, in interconnecting within all of us. Instead of emphasizing our breakpoints, what are the things that combine us and make us far more dependent on each other? Instead of trading between India and Pakistan through Dubai, why not trade directly between us? Much cheaper, much easier, much fresh commodities reach on each other's side. But because, last point I'm making, because these larger external rivalries influence our local rivalries far too much, is why we are often waylaid and we end up doing things that are not in our long-term interests. And that is where I think in this recalibration that is occurring now because of external and internal factors, I underline that there are greater challenges than opportunities, but I'm not denying the fact that there are no opportunities. So in that sense, there is a little window where things can be sorted out. And I think to some extent, we are seeing that happening, whether it is India-Nepal relationship or India-Bangladesh relationship or India-Sri Lanka relationship. Things are beginning to also showcase that some initiatives are also being directly impactful on the ground and showcasing that good things can happen within the South Asian subcontinent and people can connect with each other. But it doesn't mean that the external, bigger global structural factors have stopped being influential. And that is where I think we all need to be really underlining the fact that we need to wake up. And I agree with all of you, Afghanistan is a is a great case study for all of us to understand how we have to be really taking care of this region by ourselves, engaging others, but on our own terms. Thank you. Pramod, back to you.
Thank you, sir. Jerome, would you like to say anything at the end before we wrap up?
Sure. Of course, the region has to take care of its own future. What I was suggesting that the region should be pushing the United States and China into cooperative relations. That's going to be good for everybody, whether they're Latin America or in Bangladesh. And when I take a look at all of the areas of potential collaboration, the only one I can think that actually could work right now would be environmental security. Environmental security has the advantage. It's not only dealing with diplomacy and science, it's also dealing with military officers, because a lot of the military officers got environmental security as part of national security. And the most important environmental security issue for us and the world is global warming. And it's a safe bet that not everything's going to be solved today in Scotland. So I would urge all of the region to push both China and the United States into some sort of specific long-term environmental security goal. Something that's clear, like land a man on the moon. Something, I don't care what it is, as long as it's there. And then you have an R&D program to get it done that everybody else can collaborate with. Everyone else can collaborate with. But first, I think that's it. And I think that would give great hope to the world of serious collaboration between China and the United States. And I just hope you'll take that idea seriously.
Thank you, Jerome. Distinguished speaker and dear participants, here we come to the end of the program. I'd like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful remarks. It was a great learning experience for me, and I'm sure all our audience immensely benefited from it. We wish to have it again in future, maybe in real, in Kathmandu, or maybe in some part of South Asia in days to come. We'd also like to thank all our audience for the kind presence. We're really sorry for not keeping it on time. I, on behalf of the organizer, apologize for the inconvenience caused. Have a nice day to our participants from the US, and good evening to our friends in Asia. Thank you.